Let's talk about the economy. Are 20 million renters about to be homeless, and are we in a depression? In today's video, we're going to talk about that. All right, let's dive in. This came out a little while ago from the Aspen Institute. 20 million renters are at risk of eviction. Policymakers must act now to mitigate widespread hardship. Over the past 5 months, as you all know, more than 44 million Americans have filed for unemployment. I think that number might be up to 46 now, thanks to COVID-19 and the lockdowns. As the recession continues, economic stimulus payments are spent and expanded unemployment insurance expires, so many of these displaced workers will be unable to make housing payments. So they're talking about the July 31st economic cliff, when the 600 extra bucks from the federal government ends and suddenly everybody's back to really poor unemployment benefits. So they're worried about mass evictions, which would of course be a disaster for families. And they basically put together a team that did some modeling, and there was a disturbing result. 19 to 23 million, or 1 in 5 of the 110 million Americans who live in renter households are at risk of eviction by September 30th. And why September 30th? Because they're taking into account all of the various state and federal moratoriums on evictions. And so they've come up with this chart of people who are potentially facing eviction over a time frame. So, starting in April 20 and moving on up into, the fall and December 20. So they built this estimate with a model that incorporated data on renters' household income, their savings. Housing cost burden is if they're paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs such as rent, mortgage, utilities, insurance, taxes, and maintenance. And the model also accounted for new income through stimulus payments, enhanced unemployment insurance, and state unemployment insurance in each of the 50 states and Washington, D.C. So this allowed the organization to predict how many renters at risk there would be depending on the level of unemployment that they're experiencing. So the 3 lines are 3 different levels of unemployment. So at 20% unemployment, it's these numbers here. At 25%, it's here, and 30%, it's here. The official numbers, of course, unemployment numbers are lower, but if you take into effect the U6, which is closer to 22, 25%, or the shadow stats number, which is how the government used to do unemployment before they started mucking with the formula so much to make it look better, that is, in the last I looked, it was around 34%. So if the unemployment rate is 25%, 19 million people would be at risk of eviction by September 30th, as their unemployment benefits expire, their stimulus payments are spent, and their savings dwindle. And that rises to 23 million if renters' unemployment is 30%. Now let's look at the cost of eviction. So in January 2020, the Aspen's Financial Security Program published a Strong Foundations report, and it was looking at housing affordability and stability. What they found in this report is that more than 40% of renters were cost burdened before this unemployment crisis, and that 1 in 4 was spending more than half their income on housing. This level of insecurity has been building for decades, and median monthly rents have grown more than renters' incomes in every year since 2001. So this is an ongoing problem, and COVID just exacerbated it. The number of households experiencing instability, including being threatened with evictions, having initial eviction paperwork filed in court, eventually being evicted and becoming homeless, was relatively small, and that's between 3 to 6 million per year. But individuals and families that experience this severe, long-lasting harm to their financial health and security and education and well-being, it scars them. If you get evicted and thrown out on the street, it scars you. And many landlords won't rent to anyone who's been evicted or has some debt owed to previous landlords. So once you go down that path, it's really, really hard. So they're just pointing out here that 1 in 5 of the 110 million Americans who live in renter households are at risk of eviction by the end of September. And their solution is this: policymakers at every level of government need to act now And their conclusion is that the most effective way to keep renters in their homes is to pay their rent or provide ongoing cash transfers. Past research on emergency rental assistance and guaranteed income experiments have been proven to help people avoid delinquency on costs like utilities and can reduce evictions. And it's also interesting to note that, okay, they're talking about 110 million Americans who rent, but there are actually 43 million renter households in the US. So that's including families where you have two spouses working or where you've got roommates, right? So if you take the 43 million households, and this is according to the National Multifamily Housing Council, 43 million households. You take these 43 million households and you times them by 20% or 1/5, because that's the level that's in trouble according to this report. You've got 8.6 million renter households in the US that are under stress. So, you know, the question is, what percent of these are going to move in with family or versus end up homeless? You know, they're not all going to end up homeless. History suggests that only a small number end up homeless, but still, that is a lot of stress on a lot of families, and that is not good for the overall economy or the housing market. Mishtalk. So Mike Shedlock at Mishtalk noted that fewer people paid their rent on time in July than in prior months. So the National Multifamily Housing Council's rent payment tracker found that 77.4% of apartment households made a full or partial rent payment by July 6th in its survey of 11.4 million units that are professionally managed across the US. This is a 2.3 percentage point decrease from the share who paid rent through July 6th, and it compares to the 80.8% that had paid by June 6th. So it's clear that state and federal unemployment assistance benefits have served as lifelines for renters, making it possible for them to pay their rent. But unfortunately, there is a looming July 31st deadline when that aid ends, and without an extension or direct renter assistance that these organizations have been calling for since the start of the pandemic, the U.S. could be headed toward a historic dislocation of renters and business failures among apartment firms, landlords, exacerbating everything, unemployment, homelessness, the whole 9 yards. And Mish is very, insightful. He's like, yeah, this isn't surprising, but there's some other questions to ask. How many made a partial payment? Because sometimes they make a partial payment at the beginning of the month, and then they make the rest of the payment at the end of the month. How many normally make partial payments? Because there is a percentage that do this normally. We don't know what that is. And will there be an extension on July 31st? That is the question that everyone's asking. So far, it looks like no, but some people are saying maybe yes, and the debate goes on. But this chart that Mish maintains is really interesting. This is the telltale continuing claims chart. So as you can see, COVID hit, the claims just started piling up, and then they started declining as some people went back to work, but then they started going up again. And this includes all claims. So it's not just job claims, it's also if you were in the gig economy or contractor, the PUA claims. These are all the claims, and these are all the claims continuing. It's going to be elevated for a while. This is kind of an interesting data point. I've talked before about migration and how protests in the cities are causing people to leave, and I'll link to that video here. Last month, the Pew Research Center wanted to find out who's moving because of the pandemic and why. So they did a survey, and they found that 3% of more than 9,600 respondents in the US said that they had changed their residence because of the coronavirus, and 6% said that someone else had moved into their home. About 22% of respondents had either moved because of the pandemic or knew someone who did, which harkens back to the question in the last article, which is, I'm a renter, I'm at risk, what am I going to do? Am I just going to automatically go to homelessness? That's not the default for most people. Most people are going to do this. They're going to move in with a friend, they're going to move in with family. And family was a major factor in people's decisions. Most that relocated said that they moved in with relatives. And young people were disproportionately mobile. About 9% of young adults aged 18 to 29 said they had moved because of the outbreak. Campus shutdowns had pushed many college students back to their families' homes. School closings forced parents to seek out relatives to help with their childcare. Some people had to make their vacation homes their primary residences, and others, of course, facing losses, job losses, and evictions, are struggling to find shelter. Interestingly, about 9% of those who moved said they had either bought or rented a new place. And of those who had said they had moved because of the pandemic, 28% said that the biggest reason was to reduce their risk of infection. Are we in a depression? So I like Jim Rickards. I know not everyone's a fan, but I think he's a really deep thinker, great speculator, and he's probably about 3 steps ahead on any given situation. So I always pay attention to what he's saying. So Jim Rickards is making the case that we are in a depression, and he's talking about the Great American Exodus, which we have seen bits of in these prior articles. So he's asking, is the worst of the collapse over? And pretty much not really. Everyone sees growth. Everyone's excited to see the economy bouncing back. But Rickards is suggesting that this isn't the whole story. Ever since people came out of lockdown, the economy has just burst alive. It's growing again. People seem really happy about this, of course. But Jim Rickards is asking, is this it? And in the nutshell, no, it's not it. He's saying that recent data suggests that we may not reach 2019 output levels until 2023 at the earliest, and that something close to full employment may not return until 2025. And he's going to make the point with a little simple math here. So let's assume that 2019 GDP had a normalized level of 100. So that's our baseline. Now assume a 10% drop, which is about how much the US economy will probably decline for this full year 2020, according to many estimates. Okay, so that moves the benchmark to 90 in 2020. Now assume 5% growth in 2021, which would be the highest growth in decades, by the way. That would move the benchmark back up to 94.5. Okay, so next assume growth in 2022, that's 4%, which would also be near record for the past 3 decades, but we'll just overlook that for the moment. That would move the benchmark up to 98.3, but here's the problem. An output level of 98.3 is still less than 100. In other words, back-to-back growth of 5% in 2021 and 4% in 2022 is not enough to recover the 2019 level after a 10% decline in 2020. Then he takes a look at the China Producer Manufacturer Index figures that have recently been 50.9 in manufacturing and 54.4 in services. And he's looking at China because they're kind of showing us the way out of the pandemic because they shut down first and they reopened first. So everyone's happy about this because it's growing and they beat expectations. But the problem is the growth is very weak. A strong bounce back from a collapse should produce PMI readings of 60 or 70 if we were in a robust recovery, which we are not. So then it gets down to the question of depression. And I'll link to this article so that you can go and read it. But are we in a depression? A lot of people say, wait a minute, growth is weak, but it's still growth. How can you say we're in a depression? And he points out that economists don't like the word depression because it doesn't have an exact mathematical definition. And for economists, if it doesn't have an exact mathematical definition, quantified, it doesn't exist. So many people think of a depression as a continuous decline in GDP. The standard definition of a recession is 2 or more consecutive quarters of declining GDP and rising unemployment. But in Jim Rickards' opinion, the best definition ever offered for a depression came from John Maynard Keynes in his 1936 classic, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. Keynes said that a depression is a chronic condition of subnormal activity for a considerable period without any marked tendency either towards recovery or towards complete collapse. In other words, it's totally possible to have growth in a depression. The problem is that the growth is below trend, and this is exactly what the US is experiencing today. So then he goes on to talk about how depressions leave lasting impressions and details the timeframes and what happened. And he notes that the entire period between 1929 and 1940 was known as the Great Depression in part because the stock market and commercial real estate never recovered their 1929 levels even by 1940. They finally recovered in 1954. That is a huge span of time where the stock market didn't go up. And note, our commercial markets now in real estate, they are also showing signs of trouble. So he goes on to note that many behavioral changes from the 1930s were still prevalent in the 1950s and the early 1960s, and these lasted until the baby boomers came of age in the 1960s. He talks about the Great American Exodus, and we've talked about this on the channel before. I'll link to those videos, but American families are leaving the dysfunctional cities such as New York, Seattle, and San Francisco. They're heading for places like Montana, Colorado, Wisconsin, Maine, upstate New York, and other safe havens. Big cities have always offered that trade-off between higher taxes and urban stress, but in exchange, you get entertainment, great restaurants, museums, and intellectual buzz. But today, the venues and the buzz are gone, the crime rates are soaring, and all that's left is a lot of stress and taxes, so people are getting out. He's suggesting that changes like this are not temporary. Once people move out, they don't return ever. Their children may return someday in 15 or 20 years, but he doesn't think that actual people leaving now are going to ever return. So in summary, he's saying that the best case is that it's going to take years to get back to 2019 levels of input. That's the best case. The worst case is that output will drop even lower as the recovery fails. And no one under the age of 90 has ever experienced a depression until now. Most investors, they have no working knowledge of what a depression is or how it affects asset values. So even though we have history books, and even though we've got some 90-year-olds, which might be really interesting to talk to those folks, we're kind of in uncharted territory. So what's been true for all of our lives may not be true in the coming decades. Markets may behave differently, and we need to be alert for that. So what do you think? Are we in a depression? Is it just a recession? What do you think about it going on till 2025? Put your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. I have to do this to focus. So when you see my nose in the air, I'm not being snotty. I just have to see at the bottom of my glasses. It's like, it's getting old. When I do this, I think that's probably enough.